The topic of my speech today is going to be the so-called scramble for the Arctic. In other words, the claims laid by a number of countries to ownership of the North Pole. I will refer to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS for short, and also to something known as an Exclusive Economic Zone, or EEZ. But with that, we can start. German ladies and gentlemen, the area we know today as the Arctic is not actually a clearly defined geographical identity. It refers to the area north of the so-called Arctic Circle, which in itself is an artificially drawn line which stands at a latitude of just over 66 degrees north of the equator. The area comprises 14.5 million square kilometres, and for many years people simply didn't know how to classify it. Was it a continent? Was it a landmass? Was it a collection of islands? Or was it just frozen sea? It was only, in fact, in 1958 when an American submarine sailed underneath the Arctic, literally from one side to the other, right under the North Pole, that it was established once and for all that it was not in fact a landmass, but rather a solid block of ice resting on the surface of the sea. And because it was established that it was basically sea, or frozen sea, it was decided that it should be governed by the law of the sea. And in 1982, under the aegis of the United Nations, a convention was adopted, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS for short. Now, UNCLOS refers to all the seas and oceans of the world, not just to the Arctic. But one of the things it says is that any country which has a shoreline has the right to an exclusive economic zone which stretches 200 nautical miles from its shoreline out to sea. And what that exclusive zone means is that that country has the exclusive right to exploit the natural resources in that 200-mile zone, all the resources in the sea, on the seabed, and indeed under the seabed. Now, on the terms of the definition of UNCLOS, there would be 8 Arctic countries with a shoreline on the Arctic Sea. And they are the United States, Canada, Russia, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Denmark. Now, Denmark's a slightly unusual case because obviously it isn't itself an Arctic country, but through its special relationship with Greenland, it becomes an Arctic country. But for a long time, none of these countries showed very much interest in their rights in the Arctic Sea. After all, the area was seen simply as a desolate place, full of raging seas and violent winds, dark through most of the year, with temperatures that could plunge as low as minus 70 degrees centigrade. More recently, however, with global warming, the ice in the Arctic has started to melt, and these countries have realized that in fact the Arctic is an area with very considerable economic potential, and this has unleashed what has become known as the scramble for the Arctic. However, you may be asking yourself, how is this possible? Under the terms of UNCLOS, each country has a very clearly defined exclusive economic zone, and on the basis of that, surely the area around the North Pole is nobody's property. It doesn't belong to anybody. And you'd be right, except for the fact that there is another provision in the UNCLOS Convention which says that if a country is able to prove that there is a geographical or geological feature beyond its exclusive economic zone, but which is directly, physically linked to its mainland, then in that case it has the right to extend its economic zone from 200 nautical miles to 350 nautical miles. And this is exactly what Russia did in 2007, when it planted a Russian flag on the seabed underneath the North Pole. It claimed that it had identified a ridge, a kind of series of underwater mountains beyond its economic zone, but directly linked to the Siberian continental shelf. And therefore, on the basis of this, it claimed that it could extend its economic zone from 200 to 350 nautical miles and therefore claim ownership of the North Pole as well. Now, as you can imagine, most of the other Arctic countries were none too impressed by this, and they have also, or several at least of them, have also lodged claims of their own with the United Nations, trying to prove that ownership of the North Pole should actually belong to them. But why are these countries so eager to claim ownership of as much of the Arctic as they can? Well, there are a number of reasons. First of all, as I said, the area has serious economic potential. For example, it is estimated that it has massive oil and gas reserves. The oil reserves are calculated to represent around about 13% of global reserves. And for natural gas, it's even more, as high as 1/3 of all the world's natural gas is believed to sit beneath the Arctic Ocean. There's also the question of fisheries, for example. There are currently estimated to be 240 species of fish in the Arctic Sea which could be commercially fished. And that number is expected to increase as more and more fish migrate northwards with global warming to seek the cooler waters of the Arctic Sea. Now, all of the Arctic nations have considerable fishing industries, and obviously they're keen to lay claim to as much of the fish stocks in the Arctic Sea as they possibly can. The third reason why these countries want to claim ownership of the Arctic has to do with international trade. It is estimated by many scientists now that with global warming and the melting of the Arctic will probably be ice-free in the summer months as early as 2040. And what that means is that there will be an opening up of new trade routes between Asia, the United States, and Europe, which could cut current travelling distances by up to 40%. And obviously that is something which is very attractive to all the Arctic countries. They want to lay claim to the Arctic Sea so that they can control these new shipping lanes and make the most of the hopeful increase in the amount of trade that goes over the Arctic seas. Now, obviously, that's cause for concern because increased activity in the Arctic will lead to the increased likelihood of accidents, oil spills, for example, or tankers running aground, overexploitation of the fish stocks. And that's why a lot of people now are arguing for serious action to be taken by the United Nations to make sure that the fragile ecosystem of the Arctic Sea is properly protected in the future. And there are some positive signs. For example, recently a 16-year moratorium was signed by all the Arctic states, which basically bans all commercial fishing in the area. And also, we shouldn't get too worried too quickly about potential drilling for oil and gas in the North Pole, because all of these claims have to go through the United Nations, and that process is extremely complex and extremely slow. So, for the time being, at least, there is, yes, cause for concern, but probably no reason to panic just yet. Thank you for your attention.